Donald Reid, the Highland teenager who became the model Otago pioneer. Donald Reid was born at Newton Pit Castle Farm on the hills above Strathtay here in Perthshire in 1833. His mother was a MacGregor and supposedly the grandniece of the famous Scottish folk hero Rob Roy MacGregor. Donald's own father, also called Donald, was however a quiet man whose poor health led them to taking the family away from the farm and down to Edinburgh when Donald was just a small boy. They lived here in the Greyfriars area where Reid's father became a spirit dealer. One of their homes was in one of the old multi-level tenement buildings on a site just across the road that's now occupied by the most recent extension of the National Museum of Scotland. Another home they lived in was just along the street which runs behind famous Greyfriars Church, later immortalised by the story of Greyfriars Bobby, the faithful dog that kept vigil by its master's grave for 17 long years in the cemetery just beside the church. Young Donald also had a dog, a secret pet called Dido, that he kept hidden in a shed until his parents found out. Donald's secure life in central Edinburgh came to a sudden halt with the death of his father in 1844. Left with 3 boys to care for, his mother quickly remarried, and Donald was sent back to the family farm in Strathtay to live with his uncle Alexander and his family of older female cousins. The 11-year-old Donald walked most of the 110-kilometre journey to Strathtay on his own. It led nonetheless to a happy time back here in the beautiful Perthshire countryside, where Donald worked on the farm but also managed to get 4 years solid education at Daniel Stewart's famous school here at Gennard. Donald's route to the school took him down through the woods of the neighbouring Findinett estate, and years later he would name his own home in Abbotsford after this idol of his teenage years. But this pleasant time back in Strathtay came to a sudden end with the death of his uncle. Donald was sent back down to Edinburgh to his own family, but he wouldn't be there for long. In late 1848, as news filtered back to Scotland of the arrival of the very first party of settlers in Otago, Reid's family decided to follow them. As members of the Free Church, Donald, his mother and his 2 brothers all qualified for free passages and secured them on the ship Mary. However, his stepfather, perhaps because he was a Catholic, had to pay his own way. And then at the last minute, Donald's older brother, 20-year-old Charles Reid, convinced Charlotte Young to marry him and come as well. 2 days after their wedding, they all set sail for Otago on the Mary. It was a long journey, 3 months to reach New Zealand, and a further 2 months for the ship to make calls at Nelson, New Plymouth, and Wellington. Finally, in April 1849, they reached Port Chalmers. John Dalton and Charles Reid were both bricklayers, and they went into partnership together, easily finding work in the embryonic settlement. Donald, meanwhile, at 16, a well-educated youth with plenty of agricultural experience, got his start with the Valpys, working on their farm Forbury here at St Clair. This is where the Reid-Dalton whānau built their first house in Dunedin. It was then a raw section on the edge of the bush and just above the shoreline. Charles Reid built his first home just around the corner in Walker Street, now called Carroll Street. Donald, meanwhile, full of grit and determination, had his sights firmly set on owning a farm of his own. Contracting out his labour and saving his pennies, he leased his first piece of land in Caversham in 1850. 2 years later, not yet 20, he bought his first block of land on the future site of the old Caversham School. By 1854, he had 200 acres under development and was grazing cattle out on the Tyree. Now, he gradually added to those holdings, and in 1856 moved out to the Tyree, where his property Salisbury, named after the Salisbury Crags of Edinburgh, was to become a model farm. In 1854, Donald married Frances Barr, the daughter of John Barr of Little Paisley, who had produced the first cloth woven in Dunedin. The couple had 4 sons and 5 daughters together before Francis died in 1868. 6 years later, he married the young widow Sarah Price. Now, she already had 2 sons and they had a daughter together. And this large blended Reid family lived in this magnificent homestead that had been designed for them by Robert Lawson, completed in 1873. It took the place of that original wattle and daub cottage that Donald had built when he first moved out here in 1856, as well as the brick house that followed, gradually representing those improvements, his rapid rise to prosperity. Reid was a canny farmer and an astute judge of men. During the gold rush, for example, he made a deal with his farm workers. They would all go up to the goldfields together and split any proceeds, but return to the farm for the harvest in spring. This was a great way of dealing with gold fever, but retaining the service of his workers. Reid also made a tidy sum by arranging for supplies to be carted to the goldfields, a much surer way of making your fortune than actually digging for gold. Later in life, Reid established a stock and station agency that also became very successful and survived until 2001 as Reid Farmers. Reid also became prominent as a provincial and then a national politician, serving for a time as Minister of Immigration in the 1870s. But he was never as notable on the national stage as in Otago. Here, he was a man of huge mana, known for his unimpeachable integrity and epitomising all those values of hard work, thrift and honesty that were so esteemed by the Presbyterian Scots. And his life's trajectory from those early years in Strathtay in Edinburgh to his prosperous position as a substantial land proprietor on the Taieri with a large family made him the exemplar of a successful migrant story. Not surprisingly then, in 1900, the Otago Settlers Association elected him as its president. He proved to be a great leader, ensuring that the association and its museum had the support of all those pioneering families who held him in such high esteem. When he tried to resign, they simply wouldn't let him, prevailing upon him to remain at the association's head until his death in 1919. And thereafter, his substantial bequest to the Early Settlers Association underwrote the development of this, the first extension to the museum site, known as the Donald Reid Wing in 1921.